Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked, but it is not a requirement. However, any individuals with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. Finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. Good morning, and thank you to our panel of expert witnesses for joining us today to discuss nuclear waste cleanup managed by the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. The focus of the discussion today will be on how targeted research and development on innovative technologies can be leveraged to perform cleanup faster and at lower cost. Some of the nuclear waste we're talking about today was generated almost 60 years ago when the global nuclear arms race during the Cold War spun out of the Manhattan Project. The majority of the legacy nuclear waste that the department is responsible for is from government-sponsored weapons development and production. However, the Manhattan Project was also the genesis for peaceful uses of nuclear technology, such as nuclear energy. Some of the legacy nuclear waste is also from government-sponsored research and development to further these peaceful purposes. Regardless of the defense or non-defense application, the government has an obligation to the American people to responsibly manage and dispose of this legacy waste. So, why are we talking about this on the Science Committee when our legislative jurisdiction is over civilian research and development? This is because the Science Committee is all about finding and applying scientific solutions. Though the budget for the non-defense portion of the Office of Environmental Management is only a little over 4% of the budget for the entire office, much of the science we can use to improve the cleanup process is the same. And when we're learning from experts in the field, many of which are here today, that the life cycle cost estimates for the remaining cleanup activities are growing to the order of $500 billion or more, it would be irresponsible of us to not look at the science. Unfortunately, the budget dedicated to research and development has shrunk from 5% of the budget a few decades ago to only 1/3% in recent years. The good news is we have a good idea of the work that needs to be done. The experts before us have all closely reviewed DOE's Office of Environmental Management. The analysis have been complete, the reports published. They all have the same conclusions and recommendations. We must look at opportunities for improvement across the cleanup enterprise holistically, and we must increase our investment in research and development of innovative technologies that can be widely used to enable more efficient cleanup. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today go into detail on proposals to do just that. Before I close, I want to acknowledge the impressive work that the Office of Environmental Management has done to date. Thankfully, the department has successfully completed a lot of their work here, as only 15 sites out of the 107 remain. I was especially pleased to see the work at the Brookhaven National Lab in my home state of New York finish up successfully just this year. This is a tough job. I want to recognize that and thank those of you who work to make it better. With that said, thank you all again for being here today, and I look forward to this discussion. The chair now recognizes Mr. Weber for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management, or EM as we call it, the largest environmental cleanup program in the world, has been charged with the formidable task of managing the environmental legacy of the Cold War. This means cleanup of nuclear contamination resulting from decades of weapons testing and government-sponsored energy research. Their work includes treating millions of gallons of radioactive waste, decommissioning contaminated buildings, and remediating contaminated soil as well as groundwater. It's a big job, without a doubt. But while EM has made great progress completing cleanup at 92 of 107 sites across the country. The estimated cost of these activities has more than doubled in the last decade. That means the life cycle cost for cleanup activities at the remaining 15 sites could reach as high as $720 billion with a B dollars. It is absolutely critical that we get these costs under control. The 15 remaining cleanups are estimated to take decades. If we don't address our costs and liabilities, they will only continue to grow. In other words, things are only going to get worse unless we make some changes. In fact, the Government Accountability Office added the federal government's environmental liabilities to its, quote, high-risk list, end quote, in 2017, meaning EM's programs are among the most vulnerable to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And it has remained on this list ever since. But today's hearing will focus mainly on the positives by exploring strategies for EM to leverage innovation that will shorten cleanup times and help it perform its decontamination work safely, more efficiently, and hopefully at a cheaper cost to the taxpayer. As part of our efforts to encourage EM's use of R&D to address the greatest challenge at remaining cleanup sites, Congress has called on both the National Academies and GAO to address strategies to improve EM's efforts. In its 2019 assessment, a National Academies Committee found that EM's management of its science and technology activity is uncoordinated across its sites. It also found that EM demonstrated, quote, little to no interest, end quote, in science and technology development that could contribute to the development of breakthrough technologies. That certainly sounds like a huge missed opportunity to me. In GAO's 2021 report, they reported some alarming findings, such as the lack of a common definition of R&D for EM, and no systematic efforts to track expenditures, much less prioritize needs across the EM complex. Furthermore, GAO found that EM lacked any systematic method for evaluating the investments in R&D that the EM did make. But hopefully today's hearing is the first step in a brighter outlook for the future. I look forward to hearing about the recommendations from GAO and the National Academies, as well as EM's efforts to implement them. In addition, I want to encourage EM to better collaborate with other relevant program offices across the department. The Office of Science, the Office of Nuclear Energy, and other programs at DOE are already tackling today's toughest research challenges and pursuing cutting-edge technologies. It would certainly make sense that these offices, including the world-class facilities at the national labs, coordinate and collaborate with EM to reduce cleanup costs in time. And on that note, I look forward to hearing how the Savannah River National Laboratory, EM's only national laboratory, is supporting cleanup efforts across the country. In managing this lab, Battelle Memorial Institute has partnered with 5 universities and 2 small businesses. I hope we can identify other opportunities for stakeholders to collaborate in addressing those same environmental cleanup challenges. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, your expertise on this issue, and Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Mr. William White is the Senior Advisor for the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management, or EM. Prior to being appointed in November 2021, he has served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for EM and as Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Science, and before joining EM, he served as the Chief of Staff and Associate Principal Deputy Administrator for DOE's National Nuclear Security Administration. Dr. Vahid Majidi is the Executive Vice President and Director of Savannah River National Laboratory. As DOE's Environmental Management Laboratory, SRNL provides scientific and technological direction and program support for the nation's legacy waste cleanup program. In previous senior positions in the federal government, Dr. Majidi recently reported to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, and the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He has more than 30 years of experience in the areas of chemistry, measurement science, and technology, national and homeland security, science and technology policy, and nuclear non-proliferation. Dr. John Plodinec served as Vice Chair on the National Academies Committee on the Independent Assessment of Science and Technology for the Department of Energy's Defense Environmental Cleanup Program. Dr. Plodinec's career has spanned nearly 50 years in research and development. His work on radioactive waste characterization and glass processing was an integral part of the design of the Defense Waste Processing Facility at the Department of Energy's Savannah River site, the nation's first facility to incorporate high-level nuclear waste and glass. He has regularly been consulted by several of the DOE sites, by DOE headquarters, and by external groups such as the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board and the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Nathan Anderson serves as a director in the U.S. and International Nuclear Security Group and Cleanup Group at the Government Accountability Office. His work contributes to assessments of two high-risk areas, DOE project and contract management and the U.S. government's environmental liabilities. Mr. Anderson previously served as an assistant director where he led a suite of projects examining DOE nuclear waste cleanup issues. He also helped lead GAO's work for the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions Working Group on Environmental Auditing, which culminated in a framework to help national audit offices with fewer resources design and implement audits for environmental issues. Thank you all for joining us today. As our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start with Mr. White. Mr. White, please begin.
Chairman Bowman, Ranking Member Weber, and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to appear before you today to represent the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. EM is focused on its commitment to clean up the environmental legacy of the national defense programs that helped end World War II and the Cold War. This work helps address the government's responsibilities to the communities that played such an important role in U.S. history. More importantly, it helps position them to continue to grow and thrive in the future. Today, we've completed cleanup activities at 92 of 107 sites, and most recently completing legacy work at Brookhaven in New York. These historical accomplishments were enabled by the significant investments Congress has made in the EM program and aided by technology development and research. Today, EM is continuing to advance the cleanup mission by achieving impactful progress across the country. More than 200 transuranic waste shipments were received last year at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, bringing the total to more than 13,000 shipments safely transported. That includes shipments from Los Alamos, where the team certified and completed 30 shipments to WIP just last year. At the Hanford site in Washington State, we've begun large-scale treatment of radioactive tank waste in the tank-side cesium removal system, another project we recently completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Demolition of the Building 326 uranium process building was just completed, marking the most significant cleanup milestone to date at the Portsmouth site in Ohio. Deactivation and decommissioning is also advancing at sites like West Valley Demonstration Project in New York. And technology R&D plays a role in these and other priorities. By leveraging the expertise of the national labs, other DOE offices, industry, and academia, EM routinely deploys technology advancements in the areas of tank waste cleanup, soil and groundwater remediation, facility decommissioning and decontamination, and worker safety. Multiple national laboratories have been involved in efforts that have led to innovative environmental monitoring systems that provide long-term protection at our legacy soil and groundwater contamination sites. Applied R&D efforts have led to advancements in the area of air filtration and treatment to better protect workers as they perform their cleanup work. Testbed initiatives are being used at multiple sites to evaluate technologies to address higher priority program needs. Technology R&D has also accelerated tank waste treatment at the Savannah River site, and that may have application at other sites as well. And more energy efficient and sustainable methods for safeguarding groundwater have been developed and deployed. While steady progress continues across all sites, the EM mission has decades to go at some sites and accounts for at least $400 billion in environmental liabilities. Given the magnitude of the remaining cleanup mission, EM must keep developing innovative approaches to accelerate progress, increase efficiency, and protect human health and the environment. I appreciate the support provided by Congress and the recommendations offered by the Government Accountability Office, the National Academies of Science, and others. As we work to enhance our R&D efforts, EM takes a comprehensive approach to prioritizing all of its cleanup work, including the associated technology development. For example, one of EM's top priorities is addressing Hanford's tank waste mission, which represents one of the department's largest financial and environmental liabilities. That's why EM is leveraging the expertise of our Savannah River National Laboratory and the entire network of national laboratories for environmental management and stewardship to develop an R&D roadmap for accelerating the Hanford tank waste mission. Utilizing increased funding, EM is also expanding our partnerships with minority-serving institutions. This enables us to add a technology curriculum and a research grant partnership involving EM, minority-serving institutions, and the national laboratories. EM is committed to maximizing the benefit of the available R&D investments while maintaining the momentum of cleanup progress, meeting regulatory milestones, and bringing EM sites closer to completion. In partnership with the national laboratories, EM is conducting a holistic EM technology review to ensure that the labs have overall unity of effort, that they are efficient, and that they provide maximum value. I appreciate the subcommittee's interest in utilizing technology development to enhance the environmental cleanup mission, and I look forward to working with Congress on ways to build on the ongoing improvements we have in this area. I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Next, we will have Dr. Majidi.
Good morning, Chairman Bowen, Ranking Member Weber, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting Savannah River National Laboratory to testify and discuss our mission to highlight the value of our work to our nation. Savannah River National Laboratory is the only national laboratory stewarded by the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. Additionally, we make significant contributions toward the Office of Legacy Management and National Nuclear Security Administration programs, including nuclear deterrence and non-proliferation activities. Battelle Savannah River Alliance, or BSRA, is charged with the management and operation of our laboratory. Our experience and deep understanding of challenges associated with Department of Energy's cleanup mission is rooted in 7 decades of resolving our nation's most complex nuclear material processing problems. Our laboratory provides applied science and engineering innovations for DOE's 15 active cleanup sites and 101 post-closure management sites. Savannah River leads the network of national laboratories for environmental management and stewardship. This network coordinates science and technology solutions for both EM and LM. This fiscal year, SRNL led a team in analysis of supplemental treatment approaches for Hanford low-activity waste. We updated the complex wide soil and groundwater technical targets to develop a national groundwater management strategy for EM, and we're creating an R&D roadmap for accelerating and reducing risk for the Hanford waste tank treatment mission. We're also providing recommendations for long-term actions to mitigate risks for legacy management sites. Our main mission is to provide modern and practical solutions to environmental cleanup and long-term surveillance and maintenance problems. This includes our latest work on assessing the climate vulnerabilities of EM and LM sites. When appropriate, we work across different program offices to bridge the need for research and development. For example, extracting unique isotopes for non-proliferation programs will also benefit DOE's Office of Science, EM, and other NNSA programs. The Advanced Research Project Agency Energy, or ARPA-E, is funding SRNL to use our expertise in glass and ceramics in partnership with recycling and manufacturing sector to create more durable cement and other advanced materials. University partnerships are critical to our success, and we leverage them to develop our future workforce. Cleanup and remediation projects are designed to meet local stakeholder needs. As such, we purposefully work with many stakeholders and train our workforce to understand the impact of technology within the regulatory requirement domain. Since 2014, the Office of Environmental Management's Minority Serving Institution Program partnership has been executed by Savannah River National Laboratory. We work with 5 other national laboratories to provide internship and support to historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions. Most recently, we have expanded the program, providing funding for postdoctoral research and graduate fellows. To accelerate cleanup mission, our laboratory provides processing, remediation, and closure approaches with a rigorous data-driven foundation. We develop high-impact technologies to overcome barriers while minimizing waste production in the disposition of nuclear materials. We focus on remediation strategies using passive technologies to reduce cost and long-term maintenance. We pioneer innovations to reduce long-term monitoring costs through integration of sensor networks and by providing high-fidelity assessment. Mr. Chairman, Savannah River National Laboratory's expertise and innovative spirit uniquely positions the lab to help the Department of Energy accelerate cleanup activities and realizing a reduction in liabilities and costs. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Majidi. Next, we will have Dr. Plodinec.
Thank you. Slight technical glitch there. My thanks to, let me back out of there a little bit. Chairman Weber, should be Chairman Bowman, Ranking Member Weber, and the rest of the subcommittee. You have my written testimony. I'm going to, in my oral testimony, try to make 3 points that I think are very important for the discussion today. First, it was clear to our committee that there are opportunities for science and technology developments that could reduce costs, quicken cleanup, and reduce risk. We found that EM, however, did not have a comprehensive program at that time to identify or capture them. The committee identified 7 areas where S&T developments could reduce costs, and those are shown on the control knobs graphic on page 5 of my written testimony. Let me mention just one. Chemistry. Chemical separations are and will continue to be of great importance to EM throughout the dispositioning of tank waste. Over the last few years, tremendous progress has been made in such subfields as microseparations and accelerated chemical processing. If these advances were deployed for processing liquid waste, particularly in the tanks, advances in these areas could increase efficiency, reduce the cost, and the time required. But that brings me to my second point. A positive return on these public investments in science and technology can only occur if they are deployed at the DOE sites. That means that EM's cleanup contractors have to deploy them. That's relatively easy at the start of a particular project or contract. It becomes more and more difficult as facilities are built and processing starts and as contracts approach their completion. Further, cleanup contracts themselves are focused on maximizing cleanup within the life of the contract, not on finding potential solutions for waste streams not included in the contract. That brings me to my third point, the importance of what I call the technology tailor. In the innovations literature, this is often called the knowledge broker or the gatekeeper, but these terms don't reflect what has to happen within the DOE-EM context. EM's biggest cleanup challenges, the ones where S&T can really have a big return on investment, pose complicated, often wicked problems. They're multidimensional, multifarious for that matter. They require stitching together pieces from several technologies and then testing the combined fabric, if you will, and making alterations so that the proposed solutions actually fit EM's needs. Thus, the technology tailor plays a crucial role by translating science into operations. The National Academies Committee saw instances where technology tailoring had occurred, but saw no evidence at that time that the importance of this tailoring function was recognized by EM. However, I must say, Dr. Majidi's testimony indicates that the importance of this crucial element of a comprehensive S&T program is beginning to be recognized. And that's a very positive development. With that, I'll stop. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Plodinec. And finally, we will have Mr. Anderson.
Chair Bowman, Ranking Member Weber, members of the subcommittee. Good morning. I'd much prefer to be with you in person, but the COVID bug finally bit me a few days ago, hence my virtual participation. Research and development has played an essential role in federal efforts to clean up massive amounts of radioactive and hazardous waste. produced by more than 75 years of nuclear weapons production and energy research. Advances in R&D have enabled DOE's Office of Environmental Management to carry out this cleanup using safer, more efficient, and more effective approaches. But the proportion of EM's budget specifically designated for R&D has generally declined since 2000. At the same time, DOE's environmental liabilities, the estimated costs to clean up radioactive and hazardous waste, are now over $500 billion. In recent years, the growth in these life cycle costs on average have significantly outpaced annual spending on efforts to address them, creating a situation not unlike an interest-only mortgage. We need to look at smarter ways of doing business to chip away at the principal. My testimony today discusses our findings and recommendations from two recent reports on the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. Our findings have implications on the outcomes and effectiveness of investments in R&D. Specifically, I'll discuss the extent to which EM coordinates R&D across the complex, prioritizes R&D efforts, and has sustained and consistent leadership commitment, which can help an R&D program. Regarding EM's coordination of R&D, it's important to note that EM has a number of players involved in these activities, including its network of national labs, 15 cleanup sites, its technology development office, and other offices such as the Office of Science. In our October 2021 report, we found that coordination amongst these different entities was a mixed bag, with some positives and some challenges. Positives include EM's ability to clarify roles and responsibilities, such as through the National Lab Network, to help ensure the right people and groups are often at the table. Challenges include identifying and tracking resources used for R&D and defining and measuring outcomes for such investments. For example, EM doesn't have internal systems to track R&D expenditures throughout the complex or monitor their effectiveness. Of the nearly $300 million broadly characterized as annual funding for R&D, we were unable to track investments for about $180 million. Regarding prioritization, we found that EM's Technology Development Office had not taken a comprehensive approach to prioritizing R&D for nuclear cleanup. In the absence of a comprehensive approach, individual EM sites and DOE laboratories developed their own methods for making prioritization decisions. It's also important to note that the way that money is allocated for R&D and restrictions on spending result in pressures to direct resources to address immediate operational needs. As a result, there can be pressure to divert resources away from forward-looking R&D efforts that could bring long-term efficiencies. Prior studies of EM's R&D efforts have identified concerns about EM's level of investment in breakthrough research in favor of incremental research. Better coordination and prioritization tie into my third point about the need for enhanced and committed leadership within DOE and EM, which may also enhance the effectiveness of its R&D efforts. And let me be clear, this is an area where Congress can help. To set the stage, EM has experienced frequent turnover in its top leadership positions since it was established in 1989. In the last 2 decades, there have been 5 Senate-confirmed assistant secretaries and 9 acting assistant secretaries or senior advisors. Frequent turnover has created challenges for achieving the department's complex and long-term cleanup mission, such as difficulty in building relationships with states and local communities, inconsistent and incomplete initiatives, and a focus on short-term actions over long-term priorities. In addition to frequent turnover in leadership, EM's position within DOE's organizational structure has been unstable. EM has reported to DOE's Deputy Secretary and 3 undersecretaries at different points throughout EM's history. Earlier this year, we recommended Congress establish a term appointment for EM's top leader and create a new DOE undersecretary position for environmental cleanup. Chair Bowman, Ranking Member Weber, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions that you may have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson, and I just want to note for the record that each witness's testimony was well under 5 minutes. That's incredible. Congratulations to all of you. At this point, we will begin our first round of questions. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I'm going to try to get through 3 questions. Let's see if we can make it. Mr. White, thank you again for joining us today. In its October 2021 report, GAO noted some actions that DOE should be taking to maximize the potential of EM science and technology activities. I'm hoping you can give us a status report on a couple of those. First, GAO found that EM did not have a common definition of R&D for DOE programs, contractors, and other stakeholders to use. This makes it hard to coordinate or even fully evaluate the research activities associated with environmental cleanup. Has DOE since developed and shared a common definition for R&D through the EM complex? If not, do you have an estimated date of completion? Also, GAO also found that EM does not have an internal system to systematically track cleanup-related R&D expenditures across DOE, which seems related to the lack of a definition for R&D. Has DOE made any progress toward establishing such an internal tracking system? Do you have an estimated date of completion for this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to report that we have in fact established a definition for research and development that we promulgated across the EM complex. We did that last year. We've also developed and put in place a database to track our technology development activities across the EM enterprise. To date, we've only populated that database with the activities that we fund directly out of our headquarters technology development program, which is the smallest part of it. By the end of the year, I expect we will have taken our first shot at pulling in all of the sort of applied R&D stage activities that occur at our different sites.
Awesome. Mr. Anderson, since we're talking about the recommendations from your report, do you have anything to add to our dialogue on this?
The one thing I would add is the EM we found had taken a bit of an ad hoc approach to managing its R&D portfolio. Our recommendations are aimed at enhancing coordination and improving prioritization, all with an eye toward developing smarter ways to chip away at that $500 billion liability. We're heartened to hear that EM agreed with our recommendations, and we look forward to seeing the steps taken to implement them.
Awesome. Next question is for Dr. Majidi on diversity in the workforce. Thanks for your testimony. You mentioned that Savannah River National Laboratory has supported EM in managing its Minority Serving Institutions Partnership Program, which provides internship funding and support to HBCUs and other MSIs through the competitive research award process, and also funds postdoctoral research and graduate fellows. Can you please talk to us about the importance of a diverse talent pool in the areas of environmental management and how the MSI Partnership Program is helping to develop a diverse workforce for DOE labs?
Thank you, sir. One of the challenges in any S&T area today is bringing more and more diverse voices to solve technical challenges. Through EM's vision, we are executing the Minority Serving Institution Partnership Program in a number of different ways. First, we partner with minority serving institutions to provide technical guidance and supporting analysis of technical programs that they are performing. Then, we have an internship program that every year we bring interns not only to our laboratory, but to other national laboratories as well, so that the interns get a full flavor of what is going on around the entirety of DOE complex. We have started a postdoctoral program where we bring in brilliant young scientists and we mentor them at the laboratory to let them know exactly how the science for EM is done. And finally, we're starting a graduate fellowship program to bring in additional graduate students from minority serving institution programs. The diversity is very important to us because most of our diverse workforce are the ones that are most impacted by many of the national activities that is in their backyard. They understand what is the impact of technology, what is the impact of cleanup in their own backyard. So they can speak on behalf of the stakeholders, because they're stakeholders, and help us develop a better technology platform.
Thank you so much for that response. And before I yield to Ranking Member Weber, I just want to mention for follow-up, I would love to know what science education should look like in our K-12 school systems, particularly in low-income and marginalized communities, to help prepare students for post-secondary opportunities in this space. We have about 20 seconds. Do you have any comment on that?
No, that's a very rich topic, sir. And I'll be happy to sit down and to tell you about all the programs that we have in place. We live in a neighborhood that has lots of underprivileged school systems, and we are working with the laboratory and EM to reach to those.
All right, awesome, thank you. I now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Majidi, in your testimony, you mentioned a couple things that are right at the heart of today's hearing. First, you say Savannah River has been working with other national labs to help develop an integrated technology development framework, primary objective being to provide a good balance of early concept R&D with ready-to-deploy technologies. But at the same time, you mentioned that Savannah River receives limited funding from the Office of Science on EM-related search. That's not the best thing for us to hear necessarily, because there's no one better in the world better at early concept R&D than the Office of Science. I think you'd agree with that. It's no secret that when DOE offices work closely together, everyone benefits. So, Dr. Majidi, what would your recommendations be to ensure the Office of Science is right there with you from the start and best helping progress in that environmental management field?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Historically, the Office of Science has not played a significant role at our laboratory. Over the past few years, specifically over the past 3 years, we have had more and more engagement with the Office of Science, and I know that Ike will also attest to the fact that his engagement with Office of Science has significantly increased. We have a number of programs that is coordinated throughout the department, including the Office of Science. We've had 3 specific funding opportunities from Office of Science that benefits the laboratory in fundamental research. To be perfectly frank, our laboratory in the past has not been incredibly competitive in the Office of Science domain because we've had applied science and technology rather than fundamental technologies. As we mature with our new management and operation companies, our goal is to, in fact, increase our interactions with the Office of Science and ensure that that fundamental research does weave into our program. We are partnering with ARPA-E to fund our programs both in EM and in the fusion program. So the laboratory, as it's maturing, is engaging more and more programs across the DOE.
Glad to hear you bring that up, because that was actually part of my next question, to see you mention partnerships funding through ARPA-E. The Energy Act of 2020 specifically gave, as you know, ARPA-E the ability to fund projects in management, cleanup, and disposal of radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. So with that in mind, can you go into a little bit more detail what ARPA-E is good at and what other programs like the Office of Nuclear Energy might be better suited for?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for funding ARPA-E, because they're funding us, and it's certainly very helpful. I'll start with a quick story. For many decades, EM has funded our laboratory as well as other laboratories to develop glass and ceramics for immobilizing nuclear waste. We are quite good at immobilizing nuclear waste, and we have lots of expertise in glass and ceramics. So a few years back, I challenged all of our scientists who are working in glass and ceramics, okay, what is the next step? What's next for glass and ceramics? And we, in fact, invested internally through Laboratory Directed Research and Development Fund, or LDRD. What's the next challenge for glass? And we came up with a number of different ideas. This engineered cellular magmatics, which is basically taking glass and recycling them, not by putting more energy, but by putting mechanical energy and chemistry to alter the nature of the glass and use it as a more fundamentally more useful construction material. That led into ARPA-E investment that allows us to create a next generation of more enduring cement with a lower carbon footprint. We are partnering, thanks to ARPA-E, with both industry and academia to push that concept forward and ultimately commercialize it. So the fact that ARPA-E is a player in this game has been a game changer for our laboratory.
Well, thank you for that. So would you agree that nuclear waste management cannot be conducted solely by ARPA-E and requires a cross-cutting department effort? And if money wasn't an object, how would you do that?
Well, sir, I will leave that up to the department, certainly when it comes to the money. But the collaboration amongst program managers is absolutely essential. And the laboratory plays a game to bring the program managers as well. So I mentioned, I haven't quite mentioned, but we have a program called Mark 18 that brings NNSA, EM, Office of Science, all together for a particular focus on a mission that benefits everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Bowman and Ranking Member Weber, and thank you to our witnesses. I am from Oregon, honored to represent a district in the northwest part of the state, so I'm going to focus my questions on Hanford. And to set the stage, Hanford in south central Washington is about 586 square mile site, about the size of Rhode Island, where they store about 56 million gallons of radioactive waste in old tanks not too far from the Columbia River, and also not too far from the Cascadia subduction zone, where we're overdue for a massive earthquake. So with this effort, there are approximately 8,000 workers involved, and in 2021, the Washington State Department of Commerce released a report that expressed concerns for the health of the Hanford workforce because of short-term and long-term exposure to hazardous materials. According to the report, about 1/3 of the workforce indicated long-term exposure to hazardous materials, and nearly 60% reported being involved in an exposure event. So I'm going to start with Dr. Majidi. In your written testimony, you highlight research that would minimize worker exposure to hazardous materials. So how can investments in research and technological innovations increase workplace safety, and what role does your lab play in sharing these developments across the cleanup sites nationally?
Thank you for a question. A few years ago, environmental management asked the laboratory to put together the national network of laboratories for environmental management missions. And I am the permanent chair of this organization, and the co-chair rotates amongst 5 other national laboratories. This network is utilized by EM and by the sites to reduce the risk in a number of different programs. So for example, EM asked us to review technology development program, and we completed the review by putting a team together and provided various recommendations and suggestions. We identified R&D to accelerate Hanford tank waste mission. How do we do it faster and cheaper? We use technology. We did a review on using technology for remaining soil and groundwater for remediation of Hanford and other sites. So we, as a whole, look at sites that EM and LM is responsible for, and when specifically merited, we bring other national laboratories together as a team and fundamentally look at those specific problems and trying to provide recommendations to the EM program office.
And Dr. Majidi, when you talk about reducing or using technology
Yeah.
For safer work, I assume that means reducing the human exposure.
That's exactly a part of it as
Okay.
well.
Okay. So Mr. White, so I'm a member of the Spent Nuclear Fuel Solutions Caucus. So I'm committed to working with our local communities, my colleagues in Congress, and the Office of Environmental Management to develop a long-term storage solution for spent nuclear fuel that protects the environment and public health. I assume you're familiar with the GAO report that Mr. Anderson discussed today?
Yes, ma'am.
So in your written testimony, you mentioned Hanford, and you talk about the storage and disposal of spent nuclear fuel as a top cleanup priority for the Office of EM. You also mentioned expediting the cleanup. So the last report that I saw, and hopefully you can update me on this, was intended to be about a 30-year project, but now they're projecting about 75 years. Can you give us an update on how long you expect the Hanford cleanup to take?
How long it takes depends in part on exactly what we do to do the cleanup, and that's something that we're still working through. But I would say on the order of 6 decades would be a good guess. I mean, but again, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that number.
How often do you update that number based on the technologies that are being developed?
We update the number based on a number of different factors, right? It depends on how you characterize the number. If you evaluate it as part of an environmental liability, those numbers get updated on an annual basis. When we redo life cycle cost analysis work, those get updated from time to time. We most recently had the Corps of Engineers, for example, do an independent life cycle cost analysis for that work and update their expectations. When we do a system plan, every couple of years working with our regulator, we redo the system plan for the waste there based on what our current expectations are for regulatory requirements, and we'll update the number based on what that is. We're currently involved at the moment, for example, in holistic negotiations with the state of Washington Department of Ecology on what the cleanup plan might look like, and whatever comes out of that set of discussions with the state of Washington would also drive another look at what we expect that time frame to be. So I know that's not a simple or straightforward answer, but there's a lot of different ways that we do that depending on what the use of the number is going to be.
Thank you, and I'm out of time. I just want to express, concern about what was originally supposed to be a 30-year project turning into a now 6-decade project, and the number of people and the risks up there. And I yield back. I may be submitting additional questions to the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. I represent northern LA County and parts of Ventura County, and within my district, we have the Santa Susana Field Lab, which I know is on your radar for many reasons. It's an ongoing project with long-term commitment. And so we have a whole lot of questions relative to that we'll probably submit offline, but I just wanted to kind of get your sense. I think the question is primarily for Dr. Plodinec and Mr. Anderson, but as we're looking at these projects and we're looking at the technology to support these cleanup efforts, can you walk me through what the relationship is right now and what the forum looks like between the federal government and then some of these state governments and even down to the local community government level with regards to the requirements for the cleanup? And I know that every site is different. Every cleanup effort is sort of bespoke relative to the toxins and the exposure and the environmentals around it. But the requirements seem to change frequently. The levels of and the thresholds of the cleanup seem to be a moving target. And so how much of that is driven by the states? How much of that is defined by the federal government, your offices, and what does that forum look like? How do the multiple levels of government coordinate what the sort of exit criteria is for these various cleanup projects? Dr. Plodinec, we can start with you.
Well, probably I am not the right person to answer that question. I would suggest that that's probably really falls into the bailiwick of Mr. White. I would say that one of the areas that we identified as a research opportunity was, in fact, decision-making in areas of great uncertainty, such as you've identified. Mm-hmm. This is an area where it's not physical science, it's actually social science. But a lot of advances have been made or continue to be made that could really help DOE in its decision-making processes. With that, I'll shut up.
Mr. White, I appreciate that, Dr. Plodinec. Mr. White, did you want to either amplify or add to those comments there?
Well, I mean, just briefly, I think as you pointed out, the framework that we use for cleanup at each of the different sites typically depends on an agreement that we have with the state regulator and usually with the Environmental Protection Agency. We normally call it a tri-party agreement. Those agreements take different forms at different sites. And over time, depending on what's in the agreement and what the state of technology advancement is and what we discover as we do the cleanup, we'll add or amend or change those agreements. The exact nature of the cleanup work and the standards that we try to achieve at each site does in fact depend in large part on the agreements that we reach within those parties that have regulatory authority at any given place.
Do you find the states either amicable or amenable or malleable, for that matter, to data from other projects that you're providing them that's based on the science and the previous best practices and lessons learned from other cleanups in other states? Or do they, in California, we're kind of notorious for having high bars when it comes to environmental regulations and things like this, or usually, and I'm assuming California is one of the tougher states in terms of meeting the requirements and getting to a point where you can disposition this cleanup effort. But are the states actually open to seeing the science and the techniques used in other cleanups and then basing their strategies and their cleanup models around that information, or what do you see?
I would say that varies quite a bit across the country from state to state and from regulator to regulator. I mean, certainly as you think about the opportunities that you have for making cleanup work faster or more effectively, one of the The challenges that we face is working to convince all of the stakeholders involved in that cleanup activity, including our state regulators, that the better way of doing something that we think exists is not just a way of doing something that would be cheaper and reduce life cycle costs, but actually be more effective from a cleanup perspective and meet the standards for the protection of the public and the environment that we're all shooting towards collectively.
Yeah, okay. Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate Dr. Plodnick's comments. I think we can't just throw more money at the technology side of this. We have to also, the social sciences, the behavioral sciences, and being able to negotiate these with the states is very important. And in some cases, there's not enough money to satisfy some of these regulators. So appreciate your guys' efforts, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank the witnesses. Hey, I'm thrilled to hear about the advances that are being made here. This is very exciting. Dr. Plodnick, in your testimony, you discussed the need to focus resources on long-term science and technology that could reduce the cost and duration of cleanups. Can ARPA-E support new breakthrough R&D on cleanup technology?
In our opinion, they could. I have to clarify, though, what our thinking was and what's really behind the words. We did not see ARPA-E as the solution. We saw them as able to take that had been targeted of areas of high potential return on investment, and then be able to, as rapidly as possible, develop solutions for those areas. We did not see them as trying to, do the targeting per se, or to be the ones who would actually, to use my term, be the technology trailer that would then take those from ARPA-E into operations. As always, given the site-specific nature of many of these problems, there's got to be some cutting and pasting, if you will, so the particular technical solution can actually fit a particular DOE EM need.
Well, you've mentioned return on investment now and earlier in your opening testimony. Is there any spin-off from this technology, say, to reprocessing nuclear waste from nuclear power plants or long-term storage of nuclear waste from nuclear power plants or other significant areas?
Well, as you know, we're not currently in our country doing reprocessing, but if we were, there's certainly, because of the nature of the chemical separations processes, there is the potential for a lot of spillover. If we were to do that, I think more importantly, though, for things, for example, like potentially cleaning up mill tailings, potentially cleaning up the effluents from fossil fuel power plants, there is some potential for that. But I'd also mention that there's also a potential for beneficial reuse of some of those materials, particularly from power plants, because as you all know, one of the problems we face as a country is that precious materials needed for things such as clean energy, solar cells, et cetera. We just don't have a lot of that in our country. And there is some of this that are in some of the waste streams that are not DOEs necessarily, but where the DOE technology could potentially play a big role.
Thank you for that. Mr. Anderson, you mentioned that you think the budgets haven't kept up with the costs. Do you think the $25 million in annual research funding is sufficient to develop the kind of transformational technology that EM envisions?
Well, it's hard to make the case that the problem is just funding. And the reason why I say that is because when we did our evaluation, we found that EM couldn't exactly identify how much money went to R&D. Yes, there is a relatively small and certainly smaller percentage that was directly appropriated to it. But when we look at the entire suite of funds that may have been made available for R&D, it was approaching $300 million. $180 million of that larger, chunk of money wasn't able to be tracked. We asked the sites, we asked the labs, what was this spent on? And there was a breakdown in internal controls at that point, and hence that led to our recommendation that EM needs to be able to identify and track all sources of funding going to R&D. So before I make the case that more money is needed, let's look at what was done with what they had, and maybe centralizing and prioritizing that pot of funds available that is already being spent on R&D is the first step.
Thank you. Mr. White, how significant is delaying action on the environmental remediation as contaminants spread in the soil and groundwater?
Certainly, time is a big factor that we consider. It depends on the specific situation and how fast the contaminants are moving in the soil and groundwater, but that's something that we work with our national laboratories to make sure that we understand and model, and then depending on the situation, time is often a concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back.
The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you and Ranking Member Weber putting this kind of a session together. And I always appreciate the expertise that we have with our witnesses. And so my first question goes to Dr. Plodinec. And today, we've been talking about the growing costs of cleanup, and especially facing the Office of Environmental Management. In your testimony and the report from the National Academies, note that the environmental management could reduce their costs through investing in strong science and technology programs. And I think we've made reference to that here already today, but my question is this: in implementing the recommendations in the report, do you have any additional suggestions for EM on how to ensure this science and technology program could identify opportunities for cost savings and incorporating this consideration into prioritizing the research and development needs? Dr. Plodinec?
It's a loaded question. Thank you for. Let me try to answer it within the context of our report itself. One of the things that's important in terms of return on investment is targeting. That's before you actually are doing R&D. It's deciding where is the technology effort, where should it be aimed at. And it's nice to say, okay, we're aiming at reducing cost, but really it's what are those major cost components. All right, if you look at the DOE budget submission for 2023, there are three, EM's budget submission, I should say. There are three major components. The first, the largest, is tank waste. Okay, that's an area we got to target. I'll come back to that in a second. Second is D&D. In other words, decontaminating facilities and then demolishing them. The third largest component is site support. This is a very large and hidden component, if you will, in terms of our thinking, because what it involves are things like HEPA filtration, keeping the lights on, the power on. It's truly a continuing long-term, probably a fairly fixed cost, but it's a big component that's there that needs to be considered. Okay, if we look at D&D as an example, our committee, when we went out to, and I won't name the site, saw a first-class job being done using about third-class technology. There was a test bed, there was lots of testing to make sure that people weren't going to be contaminated in this D&D enterprise. But the highest tech being used was actually a Bobcat excavator. Getting the person out of the potentially contaminated site involves technology such as robotics, such as advanced monitoring and interrogation techniques. They don't have to be things like radiometers. They can be light techniques. But again, developing those kinds of technologies with an idea to get people out of the loop, because robots, for example, they don't need time off. They don't need, since they don't have head and breathing apparatus, they can work 6 or 8 hours instead of 2 or 3 at a time. So those are the kinds of technologies that we believe needed to be targeted because they were the ones that had the great potential return on investment. Great question. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and a great answer. My next question goes to Mr. White, and I'm just going to give you the chance to hear more about EM's efforts to ensure it is getting the best return on investment for R&D. And so to that end, the GAO recommended that EM deploy a system to collect comprehensive R&D data and evaluate the outcomes through the EM complex. So my question, can you share more about EM's efforts to implement that recommendation? And is this something that the R&D dashboard you mentioned in your written testimony would address?
Thank you,
Mr. White?
Congressman. Yes, the dashboard I mentioned earlier is part of the system that does in fact address that recommendation. I will point out the point of collecting the data and understanding better what our R&D programs look like across the country by collecting the data is so that we can in fact better manage it, right? Whether it's looking at how we collaborate with other parts of the department, looking at opportunities to do that, looking at challenges that we have, looking at gaps that may exist in our R&D program. So that is still an ongoing work in progress, the question of how we now manage that data and best use that data to improve the program.
Thank you, and I'm out of time, and Mr. Anderson had a question to you, but I'm out of time, so I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses. So I have to start this because I'm going to get cranky here, and I want to be very clear that I'm a big fan of nuclear energy, and I'm a huge fan of the Department of Energy. So don't take any of this as criticism of either. My crankiness is about math. I am trying to figure out within the nuclear power industry how much of the waste is innate to the process and how much is because of the inefficiency of the cycles. The Energy Information Administration reports that we use 8 quadrillion BTUs of nuclear energy in our power sector a year, which is exactly 3 times the amount of megawatt hours generated by the power plants, because the DOE does this goofy number where they impute the same conversion energy as our fossil sector to do an imputed fuel use rather than an actual fuel use. And if we were to actually turn 8 quads of nuclear fuel into the 770 some odd million kilowatt hours that we report, it would imply that all of the losses are in the cooling tower, all of the energy in the fuel rod went either to the cooling tower or to power generation, and there is absolutely no residual energy in the fuel rods. We don't have a nuclear waste problem. I suspect that's not true. So my question that I'm hoping you can help me with, Mr. White, just to start is, can you tell me how much primary energy do we actually use in our nuclear power plant industry in the U.S.? Not the 8 million BTUs that DOE reports. How many quadrillion BTUs does the nuclear industry use in the United States, civilian nuclear industry?
Congressman, that's a very good question, but I am going to have to apologize for the fact that I can't answer it for you. The environmental cleanup program really is responsible for disposition of the fuel that we have, but I'm sure my colleagues in nuclear energy would be happy to talk to you about that.
Do any of the witnesses know the answer to that question? Okay, well let me ask this another way to any of the witnesses. What is your understanding of what percentage of the energy in an input fuel rod remains in the waste and continuing to emit energy and waste at the end of the nuclear fuel cycle? Does anybody have that number? Are we talking? I'm hearing our experts up here saying 90% is in the waste. Because here's part of the reason for this. Like, I'm trying to Google on my phone as I sit here, and we all have better access to information than my phone, I hope. But I'm seeing 5 to 7% of the energy goes through the plant. If that's true, then the 8 quadrillion BTUs that we report is actually more like 300 quadrillion BTUs. We tell ourselves as a country that we use 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy in a year in our country, total primary energy use. Are we off by a factor of 4? That is a BFD, excuse me. The reason I'm riffing on this here is because
Does that stand for bad finance deal?
I will take the 5th. The reason I'm asking this is because the scope of our nuclear waste problem is in the first instance a function of how efficiently we process that input fuel. So let me get this back. If it's 5 to 7%, if you're right that it's 10%, we're whatever. We'll get the number. We'll file some requests. How much could that number increase? Because it seems to me that if we could increase that by 10, 20%, we have massively reduced the amount of a waste problem we have. And I want to make sure that as we think about waste processing, should we really be thinking about this as a front-end issue? So any of the witnesses, do you have any ballparks for how much we could theoretically improve the conversion efficiency of our nuclear plants and thereby cut down on the degree of a waste program that we have? Well, I'm sorry to be all the one making noise here, but I would love if anybody can follow up offline, because the silence to some, and I'm not saying this as criticism, but the silence speaks volumes that we are talking about waste, and yet it sounds to me like the vast majority of the waste is being created in the first instance because we do a very bad job at reporting the actual math, and so we're not even looking at the right problem. And if I'm wrong, please clarify, but it feels to me like we're wrong. I see you got maybe some comments?
No, I'm just going to say I'm sure that my colleagues in the Office of Nuclear Energy would be happy to talk to you about this at length, and I'll work with our folks.
Okay.
Make them available.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Ross, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member and to our witnesses for joining us today. As a representative from North Carolina, I'm deeply invested in the management and cleanup of nuclear facilities. Almost a third of North Carolina's energy comes from nuclear plants, making us the 5th largest producer of nuclear power in the country. And my district is proudly home to the first university-based nuclear reactor program at the NC State Department of Nuclear Engineering. Additionally, 2 of the remaining 15 cleanup sites are right in our backyard in Tennessee and South Carolina. The work of our witnesses in addressing the waste created by nuclear testing and nuclear energy is essential to protecting our environment and our public health. My first question is for Mr. Anderson. Nuclear waste cleanup requires a highly specialized, trained workforce. And I know that the GAO has a priority recommendation for DOE about making sure that it is on top of any skill and competency gaps for parts of the workforce within the National Nuclear Security Administration. Has GAO identified any workforce deficiencies related to science and technology within environmental management?
Thank you for that question. I'll answer it in a couple different ways. One is that we do have some ongoing work right now looking at EM's new contracting approach and state contracting, and the extent to which there may be workforce gaps to implement that particular approach. So I can't comment on that, but that report will be due out later this summer. We're happy to make sure that you and your staff get a copy of that. I also think it's important to note that there have been a number of estimates recently about attrition, retirement, et cetera, at the Office of Environmental Management. And Mr. White may have more recent updated data on this, but the last data I saw was somewhere between a third to maybe even as much as a half of EM's workforce will be eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And that is a significant gap that will need to be addressed in the near future.
Mr. White, do you want to elaborate before I ask my next question?
No, I would just say that looking at the workforce that we have for the future is something that we're very much focused on. We can't do cleanup work, we can't do R&D if we don't have the right folks to do that. I will say that we have a number of efforts across the country with the companies that do work for us and with our national laboratories to address this. We do this at a site-specific basis, working with local colleges, universities, and school systems. We do this from a more EM-wide perspective. I certainly appreciate, for example, the support we got from Congress this past year to increase our funding for minority-serving institutions, which is a very important pipeline for us to be able to go out and get the workforce of the future that we need. Certainly within the federal workforce, what Mr. Anderson pointed out is true. On the federal side, the age of our workforce is getting older on an average. And that's something that we're looking at very closely in terms of how do we establish the pipeline we need on the federal side as well.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, one additional question for you with the time I have remaining. In May 2020, GAO reported that the Office of Legacy Management's challenges related to climate resilience. As we have seen throughout this hearing, the estimates for cleanup times and costs have both increased substantially in the past decade, with many decades left to go in the process. How is the Office of Environmental Management managing its R&D efforts in light of climate risks, especially with these increasing timetables?
Thank you for that question. That report that you referred to, ma'am, did underscore the need for the Office of Legacy Management to better incorporate, some of the modeling on climate change into its long-term plans. Because I think what's important to note that here is that when the Office of Environmental Management completes its mission, it then hands over those sites to the Office of Legacy Management. DOE, the federal government, doesn't stop having stewardship responsibilities. And so the more that we know about the climate change and what the models may show, we need to integrate that information into our long-term planning to include things like waste disposition, where we end up storing this waste that will be hazardous to some extent for tens of thousands of years. How do we build that into the planning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lamb, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a question for Mr. White, but anyone is free to weigh in on it. Mr. White, I wanted to ask you about the issue of mill tailings. We have a site in Western Pennsylvania in Canonsburg for uranium mill tailings. It's been under legacy management for a while. My understanding is that the burial of those was successful and radiation levels remain at background. But recently there was a Ewing sarcoma cancer cluster in that general vicinity, and the location of this site kind of popped back into the news, as a concern that residents had. And so I was mainly curious if you could talk about what happens to a site like that when it's under legacy management. Is there sort of active monitoring? I think people picture it as just something that's buried in the ground and ignored, potentially threatening them in ways that people understand. But my sense is that your office is involved in much more active management of these sites than that.
Thank you, Congressman. You're right. The Office of Environmental Management is the office that's responsible for the active cleanup. And then once the active cleanup is done, the long-term monitoring is typically done by the Office of Legacy Management. That is an area, though, that we are looking at R&D to improve what we do. There's a long-term monitoring effort that a number of DOE's laboratories, including Savannah River National Laboratory, is involved in at the moment. It's one of the activities that we fund with the technology development budget that we've gotten from Congress. And part of what we do is actually monitor long-term what we put in place in terms of corrective actions or measures to ensure the safety of the public and the environment to make sure that those are continuing to be effective. The Office of Legacy Management does that monitoring, not the Office of Environmental
When you say
Management.
monitoring, are we just talking about sort of basic local radiation levels, or do you mean something?
You're typically talking about fairly extensive soil and groundwater monitoring. There will normally be permitted points around the site, both for soil and groundwater, where measurements are taken on a certain frequency. There's usually a permitted closure level and an action level where we've agreed with the regulators in terms of what the limits are going to be. We make that information public. We publish it from time to time, and as I understand it, the Office of Legacy Management will often hold public meetings in sites that are concerned about what those numbers would look like.
Got it. And Dr. Majidi, that he had mentioned your lab conducting some research on this. Was there anything specific to the uranium mill tailing sites that you're aware of?
Sorry, it's inclusive of those as well. Realistically, we're working with LM very closely to reduce the cost of this monitoring, because when you do monitor these sites, it involves active samplings, analysis, and then developing computer models, trying to develop a long-term look at these, including LM now includes some climate change data to identify what happens to these LM sites over the next 30 or 40 years. We have developed a series of sensor networks that are going to be overlaid to these legacy management sites to provide real-time data as critical issues, including additional rainfall and the outcome of that. So it's a pretty active programs. We have a test site at the Savannah River site that we are implementing in the F area. And as the result shows more and more promise, we're hoping to be able to develop this technology at all legacy management sites.
Great. Well, I thank you both for your efforts. And I know actually here in Pittsburgh, we received a research grant for basically using AI and some fiber optics to monitor the condition of the casks themselves, hopefully prevent deterioration. So I know you're doing a lot of the crucial work to protect people, and I just want to make sure people know that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're going to do another quick round of questioning, if that's okay with the witnesses. Okay, I'll start. This one is from Mr. White. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2022 called for DOE to create certain programs related to improving nuclear cleanup research and development. This includes an incremental technology development program, a high-impact technology development program, and an environmental management university program. What steps has DOE taken or does it plan to take to implement these programs? And if implemented, how will these programs change the Office of Environmental Management's approach to R&D?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that question. It's, if you think about what is laid out in that authorization language, the three components that you talked about, most of the individual pieces that the authorization language talks about, we actually have in place in the environmental management program in different forms. But one of the things that we're doing right now in NEM in total is relooking at how we manage the cleanup program at large, partly in response to the GAO report and the National Academies report that we talked about earlier. So as we do that, what we intend to do is take a look at our program review, compare it to the specific elements that are laid out in the NDAA language, and make sure that the program we're talking about developing captures the elements that are laid out in the NDAA. Like I said, a lot of the things that they talk about are in place in the program. Some of them are not, that we need to work to build, and we're working to build to do that. One of the more interesting things that we're working to contract right now is there's a suggestion at the beginning of it that we work with the Corps of Engineers, for example, to get an independent perspective on what the level of funding should be for the different components of the program. So we're currently working right now with the Corps of Engineers to figure out how to do that as we revamp the program.
Just one more. Go ahead. Okay. Thank you so much for that response. Mr. Anderson, in May 2020, GAO reported on the Office of Legacy Management's challenges related to climate resilience. As we have seen throughout this hearing, the estimates for cleanup times and costs have both increased substantially in the past decade, with many decades left to go in the process. How is the Office of Environmental Management managing its R&D efforts in light of climate risk, especially with increasing timetables for completing cleanup at some of the most complex sites like Hanford? Could R&D in this space stave off future climate-related delays?
Thank you, sir. I'd like to start my answer to that question using a bit of an example that illustrates, the theme that you just articulated. And I think it was at the Rocky Flat site where there was a tremendous rainfall not too long ago, and that rainfall event was more extreme than the models had predicted. And as a result, there had to be, some additional work to stabilize some of the affected areas. And that shows what can change between what we knew 20 years ago and what we know now with regard to some of these extreme weather events. We haven't looked into the Office of Environmental Management and how they build in, climate change data, into a variety of their activities. Although I would suspect that one of the most important places to look and to be infusing that information into modeling would be on the long-term disposition of the waste. The waste coming from the tanks, for example, has to be immobilized. Most of it's going to be immobilized in grout. How does that grout, hold up to extreme weather events? Down in the Savannah River site, it's encapsulated in these large saltstone disposal units, and ultimately will be covered with a cap. Those engineered barriers have a ton of science behind them, as to what kind of extreme weather events they can withstand. But at the end of the day, I believe Mr. White may know more about the specifics there.
Mr. White, can you jump in?
Sure. I mean, certainly this is something that we look at across the program. As a matter of fact, at this moment, we're in the process of updating the climate vulnerability assessments that we do for each of our sites. I expect that to be done, I think, by the end of this fiscal year. When that's done, what we would do is look across what we identify as new vulnerabilities that we hadn't previously thought about at different sites. And I think, in the context of this hearing, I think that also provides us with an opportunity for where R&D might help, or more modeling efforts might help us focus on addressing those vulnerabilities in the long term. Some of that work is already underway. I mean, Dr. Majidi mentioned earlier on the long-term monitoring system, one of the things that they're looking at in this is the impacts of things like increased rainfall.
Thank you. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Chairman. Interesting question. After listening to Congresswoman Bonamici from Oregon talk about the waste that was stored there, 27 billion gallons of groundwater treated, actively treating 2 billion gallons annually, and there's 24 billion gallons left. I think there's 18 waste tanks emptied and 18.7 million tons of soil and debris disposed. And she talks of being the Cascadia subduction zone, Saddle Mountain Fault, and they're right by the Columbia River, which brings to mind, were there to be an earthquake, and I think she made that mention, maybe they're overdue for an earthquake. I don't know why they would schedule that, but anyway. Is there a list of facilities? The amount of things that she listed is pretty substantial in my opinion. Is there a listing of waste storage across the country so that we say, okay, this would be really catastrophic if all of that, whatever it is, 800, however many billions of gallons of contaminated wastewater got down into the river, Columbia River, and on out? Is there a list of the amount of waste that's stored and what kind of risk is involved? Is there a list? And that's just for anybody. Dr. Majidi, we'll start with you.
So at Savannah River site, we know the inventory quite well, and I'm sure across the EM site, that's well known to every organization.
I'd also point out, as part of what DOE does at all of its operating sites, not just the cleanup sites, but the national security sites, science sites as well. Every decade or so, we update what we call our natural phenomena hazards assessment. We actually go out and look at what earthquake levels are expected at each of our sites and what the vulnerabilities are to the activities and waste storage activities that we have at the sites are to those vulnerabilities, and then make sure that those concerns are addressed in whatever the safety basis or licensing documents associated with the facilities that we use to either operate or store the waste. Certainly some of our priorities are driven by an understanding that over time, the condition of facilities degrades and eventually they might not be able to withstand a design basis earthquake, for example, and so we would want to get material out of such a facility sooner rather than later. But this is something that we look at very closely at all of our sites.
But you only update that every 10 years, you said?
Well, yeah, what you do every 10 years is relook at the latest science and data in terms of what we think the worst case natural phenomena are going to be, because like all things, the science behind these things changes and our understanding of earthquakes changes. And so our understanding of, we update our understanding of what we think the worst case scenarios are going to be every 10 years. And then on an ongoing basis, we use that as the basis, if you will, for then all of the stuff that underlies the safety of our activities, the licensing documents, the safety basis documents. That gets folded into these things that are maintained on an ongoing basis to ensure that whatever we're doing, whether it's operating a currently operating nuclear facility or storing waste, is able to withstand those design basis events.
And so what was it? I don't have my notes open, but there was 115 sites and 92 of them had already been dealt with. Do I remember those numbers right?
107 and 92, yes, sir.
Okay, 107 and 92. So of those, is there a priority list to where you actually try to focus more attention, money, manpower, whatever the term might be, or are they all treated equally?
We go through an annual prioritization process as part of our planning and execution on the program management side. You can see this reflected every year in what we publish as our calendar year set of priorities. So we have both a strategic vision that lays out priorities across the enterprise over the next decade, and every year we publish an update in the first part of the year what our calendar year priorities are for the complex at large.
And I'm going to assume that in that matrix, there's a calculation about, and I forget the name of it, the Columbia River, Hanford, Washington, is that, I think is in the area, maybe?
Yeah, there are a number of activities at the Hanford site that show up on that priorities list, yes, sir.
Okay, so does that take into calculation, are there, in that area, choose a number, 50-mile radius, 100-mile radius, is the population 1 million or is it 20 million? Do you take that into account?
I'd need to get back to you on that. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't think so, but let me take that for the record and get back
All
to
right.
you.
Well, that's just came to mind when Ms. Suzanne brought that up, and I appreciate her bringing that up. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. For your indulgence, I yield back.
Thank you. Before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.